Welcome back to the next panel, Care and Reproductive Justice. My name is Ania Plomien. I have seen some of you already earlier at the start of today's event, and I'm delighted to see you again in the room. I'm sharing this stage with three amazing colleagues who will be speaking to the theme, Care and Reproductive Justice. I will introduce very briefly the speakers to you in the order that they will be speaking. You have seen probably lying around on the tables this wonderful program, which has the program for today. It also has speakers' biographies. So I will just briefly say who they are and what theme they will be speaking to. We will start with the paper with Shirin M. who is Distinguished Research Professor of Politics and International Relations at the SOAS and a Fellow of the British Academy. Professor Rai has researched and published widely on gender, governance and development, and gender and political institutions. And she has two upcoming books, Doing Politics Sideways and Depletion, coming up this year. And today, Shirin will be presenting on something even newer than these two upcoming books, and the talk is titled Care, Caring, and Racism, which is based on emerging research offering some analysis of gendered and racialized inequality and violence made stark by the COVID-19 pandemic. We will then hear from Tracey Reynolds, who is Professor of Social Sciences and Associate Dean for Research and Knowledge Exchange and Director of the Institute for Inclusive Communities and Environments at the University of Greenwich. And she is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the Royal Society of Arts. Professor Reynolds' research centers on Black and racialized migrant families and communities in the UK, and also has done comparative work in the US and in the Caribbean, in North America more broadly. And her achievements were recognized in a national exhibition, Phenomenal Women, Portraits of UK Black Female Professors in 2020. And today, Tracey will be speaking about creative interventions as a community-based approach to caring and reproductive justice. And then we will conclude our fantastic panel with our third panelist, our very own Wendy Sigle, who is Professor of Gender and Family Studies at the LSE Department of Gender Studies. And Wendy convenes the MSc in Gender Policy and Inequalities. Her research brings a feminist critical perspective to the application of micro-level quantitative methods in economics, in demography, and in sociology. And this demonstrates how quantitative evidence tends to be problematically interpreted to inform policy. And today's presentation will draw on serving as associate editor of Population Studies and Feminist Economics in particular. And this field, in this field, Wendy has shaped shaped the debates, and her paper is informed by that work titled Thinking about Reproductive Justice as a Framework for Feminist Economics. So please, let's give our panelists a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Ania, for such a generous introduction, and I'm so delighted to be here. I've been coming to meet with colleagues and friends at what was first the Gender Institute. It was a small little thing that all of us looked up to anyways from other universities because it had such a good mix of economists, political economists, and literary sort of thinkers, and it was interdisciplinary in the true sense of the word. So as a young academic, it was wonderful, and I'm so glad to see some of you here from that period as well as from, of course, what it has become now. So congratulations to the Gender Institute that was and the Department of Gender Studies at LSE that is, and I'm sure that this department will go from strength to strength. I feel a little bit also, I was saying to Diane Perrons at the back that after the rather poetic two papers which made you want to cry and laugh and retrieve hope, to talk about care and reproductive justice and political economy seems a little bit like sort of coming down a step, but I hope we'll not disappoint too much, right?
I'm sure.
The panel is on care and reproductive justice, and I feel a little bit of an interloper here as well, because while my work is very much to do with care, I don't particularly use the term care theoretically. And I definitely have not worked on reproductive justice, even though, of course, reproductive justice is so important in terms of reproduction of life, right? And the decisions that go around that. Having said that, I do feel that care is a term which is so easily understood compared to what I work on, which is social reproduction. And it is cognitive, it is affective and embodied. Studies on care focus on how to better attend to the needs of others and how care can be better supported in an unequal welfare society. All of us need care, and we also give care, so we have a view on what care is, could be, should be. It's normative in that sense, but it can also be, as Toronto has argued, that it's an unequal regime, right? And that poses a problem not only for the doing of care, but also democracy itself. So who does what and why? Because dependence of those needing care, the valorization but not valuing of those who care, becomes an important political issue for us. Social reproduction, on the other hand, as a concept, is so awkward as a term, don't you think? It's jargonistic, sounds immediately puts anybody off. People don't have any understanding on the street. What does that mean? It's even, in my book, the worst thing anything can be is inelegant, and it is a little bit inelegant. So social reproduction, why do I use that term as opposed to care? I think because though care is relational, of course, it is social reproduction is a more structural approach to understanding how life is reproduced and maintained within the capitalist system. Further and importantly, social reproduction, through its focus on capitalist social relations, reveals how, as Foreman says, relations within commodity production become dehumanized. Alienation was mentioned earlier, and I think that's part of it. Social relations take the form of money relations, Foreman says, which pushes, I would say, the relations of care and caring into that marginal space where care might be valorized but not valued, as Emma Dowling has argued. So that's what I will use in introducing you to a project that I've been done. It's not new, and I'm so delighted that my colleague on this project, Janthi Lingam, is here, sitting there, smiling at me, which is nice. Janthi and another colleague of ours, Shanaz Akhtar, did this project together. It was part of a bigger consortium called CoPower, a work on COVID and gender and inequality, but most fundamentally, foundationally, it was also about racial inequalities. So it has been obviously, and we did this work in the Midlands, but also towards the end in London. And I have to say, working during COVID, especially for Shanaz and for Janthi, you can imagine it was quite challenging. And I think that increasingly, as I think about issues around data and data gathering, and Anjali's talk again made me think about that, how we are all data points really in this huge big data society. It bothers me that we still feel that to make an argument, we have to provide evidence which is new, which is somehow different from the evidence that has been provided before, and to live in hope. And that's why, Anjali, I'm not particularly, I'm more of the Eeyore variety than your joyous variety, because I see the evidence of a practiced ignorance, and what might be called agnotology, where there is a refusal actually to acknowledge the importance of evidence in this post-truth world. And so I feel very hesitant, especially at a time like COVID, to try and intrude on people's lives to make them into data for my project. But that is exactly what we did. Because, and that is the serious point about sort of, why is that important, is that there are, just like what you were saying about oral histories and certain written sort of narratives not being or being overlooked because they are not expected to be challenging enough or whatever. I also find that there are these gaps which come, which is what we were trying to fill, which is older people experience of COVID, older racialized people, minoritized carers, both carers who are paid and unpaid. And to bring them together within one frame, we think had not been done before. So that posed us with, and I'm sure during questions, if you ask Jayanti nicely, she'll be able to talk about it. We had problems with language. So even though I can speak Urdu and I can speak Hindi and, I can understand Punjabi, Shahnaz can speak Urdu and Pothwari, which was also the language that but we still had to use translators, interpreters, I'm sorry. But then there was also generational interpretation that was going on, right? We were talking to older women who had followed a path which was one of migration, had experienced the British state in particular ways. And we were also talking to younger women, largely, who were both paid and unpaid carers. And how did this relationship shift during COVID was something that we were interested in, and how did that shift within the context of not just the crisis that was COVID, which of course it was, but also we were quite clear that it was a layered crisis also of austerity and of racism for these communities, which was an ongoing crisis. So what do you do under those circumstances? As we know, it has been well documented that COVID pandemic and policy responses in the UK had discriminatory effects, respectively on racialized minority communities, on older people, and on carers. While separate studies have investigated outcomes for these groups, few have brought them together. So today, this is what I want to talk about. Through analyzing the narratives of everyday care and caring experiences at the peak moment of the pandemic, our study reveals, I hope, that how the pandemic was characterized by increasing extraction from and depletion through social reproductive sphere, reinforcing and deepening existing hierarchies of socioeconomic inequality. By bringing together the analysis of these three groups, we wanted to chart the intersectional impacts of the pandemic on the wider regime of care and social reproduction in the UK and raise some wider questions of social relations in this regime. So, in 2020, when the pandemic was at its peak, the adult social care system in the UK and local services, including community organizations, was severely under-resourced after a decade of government-driven funding cuts in the wake of the 2008 crisis. This was part of the central government strategy of austerity implemented from 2010, Racialized discrimination was further undermining populations marginalized because of poverty, poor employment, housing, and high levels of morbidity and exclusion. And there is evidence that voluntary services providing care for racially minoritized groups were more vulnerable to austerity cuts than others. As we know, racially minoritized populations are heavily overrepresented in the social care workforce and in its most precarious segments. While around 14% of England's working age population are from racially minoritized groups, the adult social care workforce was made up of 23% of racially minoritized workers. Moreover, ethnic minority workers in the independent care sector are more likely than their white peers to be on zero-hour contracts. In other words, structural racism is foundational to the largely privatized social care system in England's late-stage capitalist economy. The system relies on undervalued and hyper-exploited racialized labor to function, enabling it to continue on the, on the backs of workers in enduring socioeconomic crisis. So COVID-19 was not the first crisis point for the care system and those within it, but part of an ongoing crisis that started well before the pandemic itself and has continued within the regimes of care since. So in trying to understand what was happening on the ground through these stories and narratives, what we wanted to understand was the everyday life and how it changed during this time. So building on the space, time, and violence framework to study the everyday that I had developed with my colleague, Juanita Elias, we found that space is the gender terrain of care, which includes and excludes at the same time. Time is both commodified as clock time and unrecognized, unpaid labor as work. And violence manifests its regimes of labor as well as through law and policy, entrenching unequal and marginalizing systems and remaking and disembedding relations of class, gender, and race. Entwined with each other, space, time, and violence are also resisted and reshaped through the exercise of critical agency, both individual and collective, even as they are structurally embedded within the regimes of gender, race, and class. So what did we find in these three areas? In terms of space, we found that COVID produced a fundamental shift in the rhythms of everyday life within participants' homes as well as workplaces. In some cases, lockdowns that are now only a faint memory, I think, for many of us, meant the locking in of multiple generations of families in relatively small spaces. For some research participants, lockdowns meant an emptying out of spaces as casual but regular visits of family and neighbors ceased, with consequent effects of loneliness and isolation. The emptying out of roads and supermarkets was also traumatic for those who had come to the UK to escape war and conflict elsewhere. So I remember when I'd been in India at that time and we arrived here just before lockdown hit. And a friend of mine who's Bosnian arrived at my doorstep with two very large jar candles. And his only concern was that we should have light if the electricity went. And I said to him, but electricity won't go, Milia. It's like, this is not, he said, no, but you never know. They can also be affected by it, you know? So I could feel that shadow of war that he had experienced, very much part of his present in responding to this crisis. Religious places, mosques and gurdwaras, churches and temples were important for many of our older participants' well-being. These are spaces where they feel part of their community, develop social networks, exchange information, gossip about other families, and are able to share their concerns with their friends and neighbors. To be excluded from these spaces had particular impact when there was a death in the family. Many worried about the final journey home being prevented due to COVID-19. And of course, for these people and for many, many communities, whether they are Muslim, Hindu, or Jewish, what you also need is to understand is that death rituals have to be done very quickly. And if you are being told by the hospital that you can't have the body, it just is so traumatic for them. Partly also because there's a very large Pakistani community. It is, they had an insurance out so that if they did die, they would be buried in Pakistan. And they had no idea how to invoke that when the planes were not flying, right? So there were all these death rituals which were adding to their stress and what we call, and what my work has been on depletion of individuals, of households, and of communities. But it was not just the older people and who felt very vulnerable to this virus, but paid carers who were often simultaneously negotiating these reconfigured spaces as unpaid carers at home for their own children and older relatives, but also then traveling across very tense spaces, public spaces, to go and look after other old people with or without PPE, if you remember the lack of it, in their workplaces. For paid carers, the negotiation of space was already extremely challenging because of austerity, because very short periods of time were allotted for each visit to older people. For domiciliary workers who might spend several hours a day traveling between home visits, travel time is typically unpaid and is physically depleting on top of the demanding work of care. During COVID-19 lockdowns, racial abuse and violence also reportedly increased towards those who were seen to be mobile in public spaces, especially as they were also, and we were told this repeatedly, that Boris Johnson or other public figures seeming to imply that the congregation of minoritized communities somehow was responsible for the spread. So you remember those spreader events that were talked about? And that obviously meant that if you are traveling in a public space, these people were vulnerable to violence. In terms of time, being locked in meant that the day stretched ahead of our older participants without welcome social interruptions many were used to. Children and grandchildren, extended family members, neighbors and friends dropping by to check in, sit and chat, eat together. The resulting loneliness is very much part of their experience of COVID-19. The already protracted time that older people and carers spent navigating health and social care systems lengthened further during the pandemic as services became emergency only. For those unfamiliar with the care system, okay. um, Emergency only, full stop. During the pandemic, fluctuations in carers' hours may have been more extreme than usual, especially at the start, leaving them even more economically precarious than usual. 0 hours I've already mentioned. In terms of violence, as I hurry along, the pandemic drove new virulent expressions of racism. Older research participants' narratives tended to reveal the long drawn out and intergenerational effects of structural violence across their transnational histories. The pandemic also resulted, especially for care workers, in increasing everyday violence. And my colleague in the project, in the bigger project, Co-Power, Raminder Kaur, did a beautiful play called Breath, based on our interviews. I look at Jayanti wanting confirmation, yeah. The economic insecurity driven by the low pay per hour was made worse for workers with migrant backgrounds by UK's hostile immigration environment. For example, it limited the number of hours certain migrant carers could do paid work while still receiving working tax credits. There was no increase in statutory sick pay. We were told 96 pounds a week if the worker has been sick for more than 4 consecutive days. Our research participants individually and collectively did what they could to survive and cope. They were the shock absorbers of the health crisis, despite the fact that their access to resources under COVID-induced lockdowns was limited. Interviewees self-cared by carving out time for themselves, for example, go for some exercise to counterbalance the effects of the depletion caused by the combination of the pandemic and care work. Arundhati Roy wrote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, she wrote, a gateway between one world and the next. We did 2 workshops where we brought our participants together after the pandemic to address the question, what is to be done? Responding on how to address the pandemic-related future care needs, participants called for transformation of care system and structures. For example, there were calls for the creation of care hubs. Participants called for much more widespread systemic change, challenging austerity policies. Recognizing that ongoing and everyday racism was heightened during the pandemic, was driven from the top, carers demanded that government address its own structural, everyday, and political racism. They also said that they needed to challenge themselves to harness collective agency and recognize that they are not second-class citizens. Know your rights, one of them said, and know the system. But it is also true that as England and the UK navigates a cost of living crisis today with another round of austerity politics to fund tax cuts, the care system, despite Arundhati Roy's hope, remains perilously under-resourced, relying on deepening structural inequalities of race, class, and gender to absorb the increasing pressures. Future studies, we would say, would do well to incorporate the demands of our work, and the stories of our research participants for justice and equality, for reversing depletion, and for centering care into imagining alternatives that are yet to be realized. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirin. Yeah. And let's move to Tracey. Tracey Reynolds.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me, and I'm really I feel honoured to be here. And you chose your papers well, because many of what I'm going to be discussing picks up and follows on from Shirin. Okay, so and I have to multitask, so bear with me. Is it going to work? I'm clicking. Oops. Clicking.
I think while it's coming. So.
Oh, I was clicking left. Right. Yeah, thank you.
Sometimes it gets stuck.
Do I have to hold it somewhere?
I promise it was working.
It was working, wasn't it? Maybe it's just on a standby.
It was just.
Yeah, it was sleeping. Sorry?
Yeah.
I'll click. Hopefully it works.
And I have reset it.
Yeah, okay. Reproductive justice is a framework through which to move maternal care and reproductive rights beyond legal and political debates to include social, environmental and economic factors. A key value of this framework for feminist scholarship is that it applies an intersectional and social justice approach to addressing inequalities, particularly for communities that are structurally located at the margins of society. And the important work of Professor Umut, for example, highlights the gendered and racialised nature of the labour of reproduction that takes place in families and communities, which is often invisible and taken for granted. The caring work and labour underlying social reproduction is a byproduct of the marketised neoliberal capitalist system, which also serves as a system of exploitation for Black and racialised women. And we saw examples of this in the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in disproportionate negative health, social and economic outcomes for these women. In the UK, women's reproductive labour currently takes place within a climate of economic recession, austerity, funding cuts to local authority services and agencies, and the cost of living crisis. And we see this play out in various ways, some of which Shirin has also mentioned. But some examples are the over-reliance of women as family members and unpaid volunteers in the community third sector to deliver care services in the place of paid professionals. There is an increase in international transfer of female domestic labour underpinning caregiving and care reproduction, with a recruitment of cheap, affordable and exploitative female labour from global south nations to work in family homes of the middle class and elite groups, and also in the NHS and social care settings. This exploitative labour devalues and erodes the value of care work and caregiving, yet it also serves as an important cornerstone to capitalist markets systems to function, which is a point that Toronto also mentioned. Intersections of class, race and gender also mean that individuals have different status and relationships within this labour of reproduction. For Black, brown and racialised women, this labour of reproduction and the care work that underpins this is increasingly criminalised. It is characterised by state-sanctioned violence and a hostile environment and the removal of these reproductive rights. The current issue of the Journal of Social Policy, which I guest edited with Umut Jurel and Maggie O'Neill, brings together a collection of papers that shows how the UK's hostile environment has introduced a series of increasingly restrictive and punitive immigration policies with the purpose of breaking up Black and racialised families and creating physical and psychological violence for these women. This violence encompasses not only being able to feed their families, heat their homes, but also limits their access to living in safe living conditions or being able to participate in the electoral system. We also explore how these women are criminalised for their different reproductive choices, for being able to parent or choosing the right to have families. And this really supports a report which has recently just come out by the UK government's Health and Women's and Inequalities Committee, which looked at Black maternal health and showed that Black women are four times at risk of maternal death compared to white women. Studies, including my own work, also highlight that the hostile environment removes autonomous options for these women and results in poor mental and physical health outcomes for them and their children. So what role can reproductive framings and reproductive justice framings play in centering these women's experiences, while simultaneously disrupting systems of interlocking oppression? And how can social practice and research methodologies allow for a framework that is both holistic and engages community members in addressing these concerns and taking actions to change issues that are critical to their communities? So important to developing a reproductive framework, and the work that I've been looking at, is how can we develop an epistemological approach that brings together community-based action approaches and participatory action research? And you may think, why choose these methods? Well, in terms of community-based research, why it speaks to really fostering this reproductive framework is that it facilitates collaborative and equitable partnerships in all phases of research. It balances research and action for the benefits of all. It recognises communities as a unit of analysis. It builds on community strengths and recognises them as assets and resources. It promotes joint learning, skills sharing. It's about how we engage in long-term processes and commitment to change, and it's very place-based, so it's thinking about the physical, geographical space of, for example, a neighbourhood, and then emphasising how we can engage in addressing the complex causes of local problems. It's also about how we disseminate and engage with all the partnerships and stakeholders involved in terms of taking actions. And it involves systems which are a cyclical and iterative process. Why participatory action research? Well, there is increasing research interest in participatory approaches to research, particularly creative methods, and how we use the arts and creativity for inclusion and justice, but also how we can it helps us to understand how we position ourselves in the stories and how we can disrupt those stories that result in pathologies and stereotypes. But PAR methods are also important in terms of this recent agenda towards decolonising research and knowledge exchange, and how decolonising methods can critique the extractive and procedural research practices which treat research participants as raw material for academics to interpret, study and analyse. Another reason PAR is important because it recognises the essential and effective aspects of knowledge production, a point which Sarah Ahmed makes. And this creates a need to explore how social research methods can address embodied knowledge. So what I'll now do is to briefly highlight 2 studies with migrant mothers, many of whom are living with no recourse to public funding, and how I use these approaches in my research as a restorative justice framework. So the first project, my click is not very good. The first project, which is called PASAR, which is an acronym for Participatory Arts and Social Action Research, with my colleagues Umut Urel and Maggie O'Neill, demonstrates the significance of PAR methodologies in centering migrant women's voices and their embodied lived local knowledges. We used methods such as forum theatre techniques and walk-in methods with migrant mothers to creatively intervene in creating new forms of citizenship that challenge the status quo and strengthen the capacity of migrant women for community engagement. The research took place in 2016 to 2019, where we worked with a group of 20 mothers who experienced no recourse for public funding. And for those who, I'm sure many of you do know, but for those who don't, it's a particularly restrictive, punitive immigration policy which prevents people from accessing basic rights around housing, health and social welfare if they have an indeterminate migrant status. Interestingly, all the women that we have worked with, and I continue to work with, are of West African, Caribbean and South Asian origin. And it's important to highlight this because these are the groups which have strong colonial ties to the UK. And importantly, we can still see the important social legacy of British colonialism in these regions and on its people. I'll focus just on participatory theatre, and we used participatory theatre because it drew on the work of Augustus Brow and the work of the Theatre of the Oppressed. And forum theatre is one of the tools of the theatre oppressed, where participants are invited to show and share a particular situation of oppression that they have experienced. Once they have shown this dilemma, other participants are invited to step onto the stage, replace the protagonist and change the course of action. And this can be thought of as a rehearsal for social change outside of the theatre stage. So in our weekly workshops, we went about trying out different solutions and steps which are necessary for social change and to rehearse challenging inequalities of power. And while these interventions may not have been successful in achieving the aims fully, they nonetheless led to a changed situation. We developed short theatrices based on lived experiences of a hostile environment, allowing the women to be actors, directors and storytellers who could imagine and try out social interventions rather than just simply showcasing their vulnerabilities as a result of this dehumanising policy. The scenes were shared with policymakers and practitioners, including the all-party parliamentary group of migration and NRPF. By sharing accounts, the mothers and women were able to intervene and disrupt the pathologising discourses, which not only viewed migrants and their mothering as lesser than, but it was also important to them to remove the stigma, shame and fear of silence that often prevents them from speaking out against the hostile environment and the hostile treatment they have suffered. And one of the scenes that the mothers developed in the workshops was based on an experience shared by Elaine, who was a mother from the Caribbean who arrived in the UK in 2005. Elaine was allowed to remain in the UK for a further 2 years. Elaine worked part-time for a large supermarket chain as a retail assistant. After giving birth to her son, Elaine was put on unfavourable working shifts through the night, meaning that she could not find public transport to get into work. Elaine complained about this and asked her union representative to support her. The union rep withheld their support and told her that as an immigrant, she should feel grateful for having a job in the first place. When Elaine was required to take time off from work to regularly report to the Home Office Immigration Reporting Centre, the situation worsened. Despite the manager's reassurance that they would treat her immigration status as confidential, they shared this with the co-workers, and Elaine soon found that she was ostracised in the workplace and stigmatised as an illegal immigrant. So this story of Elaine's resonated with many of the participants and the women in our workshops who expressed being treated less favourably or forced out of work once their immigration status was publicly revealed. The workshops worked as a collective site and a creative, and we used skills and tools to develop a critical consciousness. We created and tested out the different scenes that empowered women to challenge and resist, and how to challenge and resist the supermarket manager and work colleagues that wanted to humiliate and stigmatise Elaine. We recognised that we couldn't change the policy itself, but we could change the mothers' responses to the policy. And this included helping them to understand that their experiences were created by widening interlocking systems of inequalities rather than it being their fault, because a lot of times these policies are very much about victim blaming. We also removed these feelings of shame and isolation. And it also provided them with knowledge about their rights as citizens as well. The second project, Finding Strength, further utilised community action-based approaches. So I worked with a local community organisation called Creating Ground in South East London, and we worked during the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown through to present day. This organisation supports and provides skills training for migrant women's empowerment and leadership. And then in this project called Finding Strength, we used creative arts as a community-centred approach for community organising and to create change by working together to take action that benefits local migrant communities. The group that I'm working with named themselves Stronger Together Leaders and consisted of 20 women from migrant backgrounds, but many from Caribbean, West African and South Asian. During our weekly meetings, we explore issues that affect their community, particularly around housing, maternity care and the immigration system. We co-created and co-produced many creative outputs, including 2 films about the hostile environment and another film about our community organising journey, as well as using play, performance, dance, routines, songs, artwork and storytelling projects to able to create stories and narratives about our experiences. The community action approach centred on creating an alternative social imaginary. They used the art-based approach and outputs as tools for dialogue and connections between the migrant women and other community stakeholders, such as social welfare practitioners, the NHS and policymakers. Within this policy and practice space, these women became the lived experience experts and co-producers of knowledge with equal power and say as any other care professional. With all the training workshops and participatory arts sessions that we created, we contributed to challenging the narrative that sees migrant women as only vulnerable and recipients of someone's support. Instead, we demonstrated that these women have resilience, knowledge and expertise to become agents of change. So, for example, I think that's my last slide. Yep. Working with Greenwich Council, Royal Borough of Greenwich Council, we were invited to share issues and to address the impact of temporary accommodation. Through a creative performance to the council, we presented 2 asks on temporary accommodation. The first was fair notice period for families who are forced to move out at short notice, and the second was free Wi-Fi access in the homes of temporary accommodation homes. We also were involved in co-designing a survey with the council to all families living in temporary accommodation, and we gave several presentations to the South East London Care Board and various stakeholder events. Our temporary accommodation campaign has achieved success and tangible success. By working with the Council, in May 2023, the Council announced that it will now provide free Wi-Fi access via a dongle to all residents living in the temporary accommodation. And we can trace this win directly back to our campaign and the use of creative methods to tell our story and to achieve justice. So in conclusion, I hope I have highlighted the transformative potential of participatory and community action social research in supporting a reproductive justice framework. These examples and the projects that I've used show how PAR methods and community action-based approaches equip migrant women with a framework, with skills, tools and resources to come together and articulate an alternative understanding of the way in which the hostile environment policies inform their care level of reproduction. Using these approaches enables processes of women claiming their rights to claim rights, which ISIN makes, and by doing so, developing programs of transformative change within their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, that's well within time. And we'll move on to Wendy when you're ready.
Right, okay. Thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you for inviting me to speak on it, Ania. Like Tracey, I think there's some nice resonances across our different talks. I was looking at the welcome for the program today, and I was struck by the last sentence, which is the interdisciplinary intellectual life at the department brings together social sciences and humanities, serving as a unique nodal point for gender research at the school and underpinning its global recognition. Preceding that, it references a commitment within the department to translate and apply the interdisciplinary, intersectional, transnational, and anti-racist knowledge that will allow us to transform professional and interpersonal engagements. I think both of those aspects of the Department of Gender Studies or the Gender Institute are really important when you think about certain social science disciplines. Certain social science disciplines are not a welcome or nurturing home for feminist research, and without a Department of Gender Studies, we wouldn't have feminist economics at LSE. It just wouldn't be here. It wouldn't be here because a lot of people who have trained to have a PhD in economics have not been exposed to feminist epistemologies, and they haven't been exposed to feminist research. If they were lucky enough to get hired here and they wanted to remain here, there are 5 journals that they would have to publish in order to get promoted. And in order to publish in those journals, you can't do feminist research. So what this department does, and what I really am so grateful personally for what this department does, is it creates a space for research that wouldn't happen. It creates also a space for the conversations that need to happen in the disciplines that silo themselves the most. That is a lot of work, it's a lot of labor, it's a lot of emotional, effective energy, and it's often unseen. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some work that I was trying to do with a special issue of feminist economics, which was trying to get feminist economics to think about the reproductive justice framework. Feminist economics is a journal, and it's a subfield of economics. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of how it formed and some of the limitations and the constraints that it experienced as it developed. And I want to use that as a way of helping you understand, perhaps, why reproductive justice hasn't made its way into scholarship in economics or feminist economics. But I also thought it would be good to illustrate some of the challenges of curating the kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that this department has done so elegantly and so compassionately over the last 30 years. So June 2022, the Supreme Court in the United States overturned Roe v. Wade in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And a lot of women who were economists got really mad. And a lot of people who are members of the International Association for Feminist Economics got really mad. The 30th annual conference took place in June of that year. And the professional association, IAFE, launched a Feminist Economics of Global Reproductive Justice online event series. They decided that the International Association for Feminist Economics presidential panel, which takes place at the annual American Economic Association conference, would be about feminist economics of global reproductive justice. And at the AGM, there was a discussion about putting together a special issue of feminist economics on global reproductive justice and feminist economics. And I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled, because if you look at research in the Journal of Feminist Economics, in 2022, there was one paper ever published that actually used the reproductive justice framework, which suggests that it hadn't actually been very prominent. And suddenly everybody was talking about this framework, and I was thinking, this is wonderful. This is a way of enriching scholarship. But I'm also a feminist demographer, and I've seen how efforts to intervene sometimes go awry when you're dealing with reproductive issues, and I was very concerned that the engagement with RJ might be incomplete or partial, and it might be incomplete or partial in ways that might replicate the same exclusionary processes that prompted Black feminists to develop and circulate the RJ framework in the first place as a critique of reproductive health and rights. So after vocalizing all of these concerns, always exert caution before you start vocalizing and expressing your concerns, I was asked whether I would consider taking on the guest editing of the journal, because then I could make sure that this was okay. And I was still head of the department here, and I was really reluctant to take on what I saw would be a very time-consuming task. But I became more tempted because as I talked to the managing editor, I was assured it would be possible to use the opportunity to give early career researchers, and especially non-economists working in the Global South, and importantly with contacts living and working there, the opportunity to join the guest editing team so that we could actually create a really broad interdisciplinary conversation in this economics journal. I was heartened to see economists using the words reproductive justice, but I also wanted them to be exposed to the way people were using reproductive justice in ways that might not seem immediately obvious if they were working within a dominant economics framework. So eventually, I said yes, and I was really thrilled when Rashida Nandagiri and Lee Senderowicz agreed to work with me on this special issue. Rashida's here. After several iterations, we came up with a call for papers that tried to frame reproductive justice as a new framework and introduce it with a little bit of a pedagogic intention to make sure that we actually situate what we mean when we say reproductive justice. And we gave examples of what we'd hoped people would think about in terms of different contributions, and we specifically cautioned against trying to combine a more neoclassical economics perspective with reproductive justice framework. Basically, they're incompatible. If you try and do it, you're not going to be doing justice to reproductive justice. So our call for papers almost was like teaching on some level, but it was really useful to work out what it was we wanted and what we wanted to challenge people to think about and take on board. The submission deadline seeing all of the discussions about all of the uses of reproductive justice at the conference, and hearing people use the word reproductive justice, and hearing about the events that were being organized in the online event series, I was overly optimistic, or probably just misinterpreting the situation. It made me think that there probably were a lot of people who were doing research on reproductive justice and that we would be inundated with papers. We weren't. And we also found that the papers that we got were really underdeveloped because this was such a new framework. And this is really kind of interesting because it's not that feminist economists aren't concerned about reproductive health issues. It's not that they're not concerned with the policies that are attached to these issues, whether they're restrictive or whether they're dealing with issues of maternal mortality. But when you think of the feminist literature on care and social reproduction, like Shirin was talking about, there's been a lot more conceptual expansion, whereas within reproductive rights and health, there's been a tendency to maintain this methodological individualism and this notion of constrained optimization, which is completely incompatible with a framework which is focusing on the social setting and constraints within which people make decisions. Neoclassical economists hold that constant. RJ people say that's what we need to study. So we ended up getting papers from economists that were really very preliminary and needed a lot of engagement and development. And we also found that we were getting a limited set of papers from people who were working more in areas of public global health. One of the reasons we were getting so few papers was because when people approached us from those areas to talk about whether they should submit something, and they were reminded that this is a feminist economics journal and you want to make what you're doing relevant to feminist economists, the response was kind of like, I don't know how to do that. No, that's fine. So the submission deadline for papers was the 28th of February, 2023, with a print publication date of autumn 2023, with pieces published online first if we got them sorted. You haven't missed this special issue. It hasn't come out yet. I've already alluded to some of the stumbling blocks we had along the way. And in order to take this project forward, we ended up having to engage in very interdisciplinary conversations with each of the authors. And we had to go through a range of different methods of communication. We had Zoom calls with authors, we wrote comments, we would do track changes and inserting comments where each of the editors would insert their comments so you could see the interdisciplinary conversation with me as the economist and Rashida or Lee as non-economists, and really trying to kind of challenge people to think differently. I'm not sure that we were able to get every paper where we hoped it would go, but I am sure that we have actually started some conversations and we've opened up space, and hopefully the publication of the journal will inspire people to really see not just the potential of reproductive justice, but some of the limitations of neoclassical mainstream economics approaches, which people who study only economics at the economics department at LSE will never get exposed to. I'm really concerned about the threats to gender studies departments, because if we don't have gender studies departments, we don't have that work taking place. And an economic perspective from somebody who considers themselves feminist but isn't exposed to the work of gender scholars is a very impoverished perspective. It's that perspective which allows the World Bank to put forward a smart economics agenda. I was really struck when I went to the 2023 American Economic Association conference, hoping to find people doing work on reproductive justice that I could encourage to submit papers. And I was surprised to attend a session entitled The Economic Impact of Access to Reproductive Health Services, which contained a paper titled, Can Personalized Digital Counseling Improve Consumer Search for Modern Contraceptive Methods? This paper, which was co-authored by somebody from Google, ran an experiment that basically gave people a personalized questionnaire and then gave them personalized rankings of the best contraception for them. But the best contraception was almost always a LARC, a long-acting reversible contraceptive. Because from an economic perspective, LARCs are wonderful because the marginal cost of each sex act is zero. And you saw people who seemed to be really concerned about the injustices of Roe v. Wade who didn't actually see the oppressiveness of frameworks that don't actually respect the agency of people. And I went to a session titled Impacts of Access to Reproductive Health Care, and was, again, surprised or not surprised to see the valorization of LARCs. Apparently, the effect of long-acting reversible contraception reduces child abuse, according to one of the papers that I saw. So looking at the cutting edge of research in mainstream economics, I wasn't surprised that the global health people were saying we don't have anything to say to feminist economists. But I wanted to maybe give a slightly more optimistic view of what might be possible. I think if we look at what's been happening, change has been slow, but we do have some outlets for change. And I think if we nurture students, as this department does so well, to understand the limitations of what mainstream social science does and how it translates into policy, they can hopefully translate that knowledge in a way that has a transformative effect. Feminist Economics as a journal doesn't have a long history. In 1990, there was a session at the American Economic Association conference called Can Feminism Find a Home in Economics? And as a result of those conversations and some of the things I said at the beginning of this talk, we saw the founding of the journal Feminist Economics only in 1992. It was founded by Diana Straussman after she took her economics department at Rice to a labor tribunal when she wasn't given tenure because her work wasn't rigorous enough, because she was concerned to do feminist economics. In 1994, I think relevant for thinking about why feminist economics might have been slow to take up the RJ agenda, we have the International Conference on Population and Development. We see the shift, at least in words, if not mission, from population control to reproductive health. And it's really important that what got embraced there policy-wise was reproductive rights and reproductive health rather than RJ. RJ was developed as an alternative framework for ICPD that didn't get taken up. And our reproductive rights fits much better with a standard economics framework. In 1997, feminist economics had a special issue about expanding the methodological boundaries in economics and started having some conversations about broadening the boundaries. And from 1997 until now, progress has been very slow, in part because people who are in economics departments have to make themselves legible to their colleagues if they want to get promoted, and they have to publish elsewhere if they want to get promoted in many departments like the one here. So after some initial ideas about really expanding how economics research is done, the journal found itself basically publishing a lot of research that wasn't epistemologically informed by feminist scholarship. And in 2019, in a paper which is about the journal Feminist Economics, a paper which asked what's feminist about feminist economics, the conclusion was that despite its stated aims of building a more transformational feminist economics through, but not only, the use of alternative methodologies, research published in the journal has become more consistent with the standard view of what counts as legitimate economic research. So discussions were happening, but they kind of got stalled. But RJ got stalled too. In 2019, the same year, a paper in Journal of Healthcare, Science and Humanities noted that the concept or broad lens of RJ is limited in its use to guide programming and advocacy efforts within reproductive health. We had policy discourses, we had economic discourses that were hugely incompatible with RJ, and it wasn't just economic scholars who failed to see its potential. People who were embracing RJ were encountering policymakers that couldn't really embrace it in the same way. You could insert into this timeline, the founding of the Journal of Feminist Economics was nearly coinciding with the founding of this department. And that period between 1997 and 2019, the department developed and implemented the course in feminist economics here. And the current decision in 2022, while sadly revealing that some people only recognize reproductive injustices when they fall on their doorstep, and fails to acknowledge that many people in the United States had no access to abortion long before this court decision, and many of those people were poor people living in the global South. It still has catalyzed thinking, and the very existence of departments like this, of the International Association for Feminist Economics, for students like Rashida and Jenny, who's sitting next to her, who are trying to take feminist knowledge to policymakers. I'm still feeling optimistic. I feel like the transformation is a bit stalled, but this experience has shown me how conversations can happen. It's made me optimistic about what is possible when those conversations take place. But it's also really taught me, if you ever do a special issue, do a workshop with the authors instead of dealing with them one-to-one.
Thank you so much for all these 3 papers that are bringing us closer to research that has to happen, and for taking the conversation forward. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions, so please, could I have an indication of some questions? I already see 2 over there at the back, so let's wait for the microphones. Catherine, if you can just get those 2 questions there, and we'll take the 2 in the first instance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for also smuggling in some humor, especially towards the end. having done many special issues, my sympathies. I have two sort of questions that are particularly for Shirin and Wendy, but I think, Tracey, maybe this could resonate for you as well. Shirin, we did a lot of work, we meaning people, Dalit, Bahujan, trans communities in Bombay, Mumbai, and Maharashtra during COVID. I was at home the whole time, and so your talk really resonated for me. So I had a question which then will hopefully travel over to Wendy as well. How did the understanding of care as a form shift for you during this work? Primarily because you're already working with communities that are intergenerational, have para-state, apparatuses to provide care. But we noticed, at least in India and in Maharashtra especially, that even those forms that were never really reliant on the state also had to shift their understanding of what care was. So that was my sort of big question for you. And I think, Tracey, when you were talking about these creative relationships to how that care can be delivered, I guess it would travel to you. So Wendy, my question is, my mother was a labor economist, so I'm very sympathetic to your challenges, and a feminist. The question I have, and this is something that I've worked with several feminist economists in the US, is the challenge around reproductive justice is that even though there are multiple iterations of value that are emerging from the wonderful criticism that feminist economists are providing, the family form is staying central, right? And I think those of us who work on queer, trans rights, etc., the challenges of working with reproductive justice frameworks is that the family form has to be decentered for different versions of reproductive justice to work. So I was wondering if that was something that is coming up for you as well, or you're still in the developmental cycle of, the barbarians at the gate, we just need to get through. I sympathize. I mean, I don't mean that frivolously. I'm literally asking you that. Because the Roe v. Wade thing has opened that can of worms, right? I mean, there are trans people getting pregnant. Abortion is not just an issue about straight women, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever you fancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. And let's take the second question.
Thanks so much for those wonderful papers. And Shirin, my question was to you as well. I think one of the points you've made was how Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people in this country are seen as caregivers, but not necessarily seen as worthy of care. And I think, the COVID pandemic showed the kind of very racialized nature through which, certain bodies were marked for failure, death, however. And just to kind of take my cue from, Claire and Anjali's panel, about thinking beyond death. So I guess I was wondering, in terms of, the data you got, and we were working with grassroots, what was happening? How were communities coming together? Mutual aids and so on. So I'm quite interested to hear the kind of the positive story as well. Thanks.
Do you want to take Sophie as well or not?
Okay, let's take the third question and then we'll...
Thank you very much. I'm Sophie Harmon. I had a question for the whole panel to reflect on this spectre of data and how we actually transform policy making. So I was thinking with Shirin's paper around the gendered impacts of COVID-19, we knew what was going to happen to women during a public health emergency. We knew it from Ebola, from Aisha Ibrahim's work in Sierra Leone. Yet at the time, I remember in February 2020, people saying, but where's the data, Sophie? Can you show us how many women were subject to domestic violence? How many kids were left out of school? And the same with Black maternal mortality in the UK. Jenny Douglas had been doing work on this for years, and it wasn't until the Embrace study came out with 5 times more that everyone went, oh, now we have the data, so this is what's happening. And that's the real thing about doing this transformative work. And I think this now comes up in reproductive justice and trying to talk to public health folks that Wendy was talking about. You can say there's forced sterilization happening all the time of migrant women in the US, and everyone's like, oh, that's terribly bad, but how much? Or the global gag rule, is killing women around the world, oh, but how much? No one takes it seriously unless you've got the data, unless you have this evidence. But as we saw from your panel, from the panel earlier this morning, that's hugely problematic as well. So big question, but it's a big day. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. And may I please invite you to respond to the question?
So, Anjali, how did it change our understanding of care? Janti, please pipe in if you feel like it. I think we'd been working on this for a while, and I think several things come to mind, but fundamentally it is that care is so enmeshed in sociopolitical relations that to disentangle that and treat it as something which is purely either affective or purely health related or to go to the other question about migration, whether they are sort of, who to care for, I think all those questions become much more sort of stark under systems of crisis. But I felt also that through this, at least I felt very privileged, thanks to Jayanti and Shahnaz's work with this group. What also was revealed was everyday care, which is not also talked about. So everyday care of grandchildren coming and sitting for 10 minutes with the grandmother, talking to her. Everyday care of the grandmother going and checking on, picking up the phone and talking to relatives in Pakistan or in India. How are you? This is happening here, terrible things. Are you okay? Everyday care of neighbors doing shopping for older people, So what was also revealed was that while the politics and the economics, or the political economy, as I would call, of care, it was something that I was very aware of because of my work, the everydayness of care, which cuts across boundaries, which are intergenerational, which are inter-community, which are perhaps organized in ways which we hadn't anticipated, was really important for me. What it also made me think of was, of course, that when we talk about care, and that's why I started by saying what's the difference between care and social reproduction for me, it didn't allow certain things to come up so much. So the community has always been a problem for me. How do you theorize it? How do you understand it? Especially under sort of deeply gendered, unequal regimes of labor, and care labor in particular. So there was an overrepresentation of Black and ethnic minority people in the care sector, but there is a huge inequality on gender counts as well. We know that. So in a way, I think it revealed, and that's why we use that framework, which allowed us not only to think about sort of, space and time and how did that shift under lockdown, but also the structural violence. And actually, I didn't have the time to talk about it, but others, of course, like Geronimus, have talked about weathering of communities in the context of maternal mortality in the US and young women dying in through that. And that is to do with socioeconomic, historical, marginalizing sort of relations of society. So that was not a surprise, is what I'm saying. The structural element of care was not a surprise, but the everyday was. So I think that was one thing that I would like to say. What did they do together? They did a lot together. There's a lot of hope in these stories, right? I mean, they got together. The phone played a lot of role in that, because thank goodness for WhatsApp. I mean, I don't know what isolated communities would do without it, right? Because it's also a financial thing. If it was a telephone, they couldn't call Pakistan, because, the other day I got a bill of £98 because I called my uncle several times. He was ill and in Canada. And I got this huge bill, and I thought, wow, I mean, it doesn't stop me from calling him, but it would stop so many people from calling. So open communications sort of elements allowed them to. We already know from migration stories, for example, of how mothers who have traveled across the world to look after other people's children do care work at a distance over WhatsApp. right? So their working day sort of extends into the night as they look after their children and then their paid work. So I think there were lots of stories, but what I loved about our last two events that we sort of talked to people face to face, firstly, that was really nice, was that they had been thinking about what they needed, both practically but also the big picture. The fact that they could say, we need to change as a result of this, we should refuse to be accepted as second-rate citizens, was amazing. But equally, they said things to us which I still haven't done very much on, but I hope to, which is that we want the system of accessing health change. And that was generational, because older people do not have, at least I don't know in London, but where I live, you know, and that in that area, you have to call at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the only appointment with the doctor you get is online, sort of, you know, a phone call. How do people who have linguistic challenges, how do people who have technological challenges, accent challenges, communicate delicate, sensitive, you know, conditions to a doctor at a distance? So they were actually very, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Tracey,
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that. So just to say that during COVID-19, because we worked through COVID-19, picking up from Shirin, that care shifted online, and it wasn't a new, so using, I know Zoom was new, but there were other sorts of online platforms as well as WhatsApp, which existed before. And as Shirin said, there's been lots of studies which look at that in terms of transnational parenting. But what was interesting to me was that this element of that you can care for online was then picked up within a hostile environment context by immigration to actually justify deportations. So this argument that you could actually, families don't have to be together because, you know, you can parent online. So they were using that to justify deportations and family separation. I think it also, as Shirin said, it highlighted the digital poverty gap. So that was one of our asks around free Wi-Fi, because it was very, very, very clear. Thinking about schooling shifted online as well. It assumed that everybody had a resource to do school online, or the space as well. So it highlighted the haves and the haves not. And in my university, which is post 1992, I'll never forget this student who afterwards, she wasn't submitting her work, and then she told me afterwards that she was without electricity for 2 days, and because they were locked down and she was a single parent, she couldn't actually you have to put it on a card. So she couldn't actually go out to put it on the card. So, as a result of that, our university did include more resources to support students who were facing that. The other thing it highlighted was intergenerational care. So there was a lot of, because particularly for older people who were for the first time using some of these technologies like Zoom and what have you, they were relying on oftentimes their grandchildren to actually be able to show them how to. I keep thinking of my dad and my son, and my dad, you could see the top of his forehead when he was speaking with the camera. So I think again, it shows the strengths of family, and so families modified and changed themselves around. Online became another resource in which we could use care, but also a barrier as well, and highlighted those gaps.
Thank you. Wendy, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you for your question. And I think family shows up in really funny ways in economic scholarship. There's a distinction in the feminist economics literature between gender economics and feminist economics. Gender is kind of neoclassical economics approaches to gender and family. And within that literature, the family emerges in some places and not in others. And when you're looking at reproductive outcomes, you often see a literature that doesn't really look at families and sort of is very individualistic. So I think when we were starting with challenging the neoclassical approaches, we didn't see the family issue as the first one we saw the first issue as challenging the methodological individualism of sort of choice theory and rational optimization. So I'm looking at the call for papers, and we said a focus on the constrained optimization of rational actors may contribute to an instrumental understanding of access to reproductive health services. Research questions and policy logics which focus on how to alter choice sets in order to achieve desired fertility, economic, or child health outcomes can imply that justice or rights can be sacrificed for the greater good. So we were, our ambition, as we said in the call for papers, was to contribute to the development of an ethical and effective transformative response to an increasingly oppressive policy trajectory. And I think the first step in that is to challenge research methods which, by their very nature, are oppressive and controlling. And if you destabilize that, then you can, by drawing in the wider network, problematize some of the background assumptions about family, but you need to actually take on board that it needs to be a multi-level analysis first. I hope that's clear. The data issue, I think, is actually kind of interesting as well. I think data and numbers to back up things can be very useful, and how you measure things is also very important. And I think part of the feminist project is to think critically about how data is collected and interpreted rather than just used unproblematically, and to actually scrutinize the often disturbing disconnect between concepts and the indicators that are used to represent them. So I think I see those challenges first and foremost as being the ones I want to kind of grapple with. I think we live in a world that is organized and approached through a lens which owes its legacy to positivist social science. And there's a distinction between dealing with how things are and how they ought to be. So maybe we need a two-pronged effort to kind of deal with how things are and make sure that that isn't being done in a way that is harmful or bad. And at the same time have those discussions about what counts as evidence and how we get our points across. And hopefully, again, in an interdisciplinary gender studies department, we have voices and academics and students who are willing to kind of take on board different aspects of that challenge and learn from one another.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all the panelists. Linking to our previous panel on the call to abundance as well as slow science thinking and listening, I would like you to join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.